Hi there, and welcome to Rachel Kelly, who is an author, a journalist, and a mental health advocate. Is that right, Rachel? Is there
Yes,
anything else
I
you'd like
was.
to?
I get a bit of imposter syndrome sort of when one's being introduced. But yes, I have. I've been very involved in mental health since 2014.
We're discussing your book, The Gift of Teenagers, where you start the book by documenting some of your own struggles with mental health, which gives you a bird's eye view into something that for people who haven't suffered from depression, for example, find it very, very difficult to understand. And I don't know if you've ever read this book,
Oh,
Matt
it's
Haig's
fantastic. Yeah.
Reasons to Stay Alive. It was very illuminating for me because, I mean, I've never been depressed. I've been very unhappy at various periods of my life, but depression is something that you don't necessarily understand. And in fact, even when you're depressed yourself, you don't understand it. Um,
No, it's
and
almost like you're sort of given a passport to a foreign land, and if you haven't had that passport, as you say, and I think I myself was very surprised by some aspects of having a severe depressive episode. The first one, which found me hospitalized, but one thing that I think I hadn't fully understand was the physicality of the illness and how very physically unwell you feel, as well as psychologically uh, traumatized. But I had a lot of very unpleasant physical symptoms. It started with severe insomnia, which is a kind of physical manifestation. But
did it come from
feeling,
nowhere? Or was
yes,
there a
it's so
cause?
funny, isn't it? Because at the time, if you'd asked me, it seemed to come from nowhere. But I had two of these very severe depressive episodes in my 30s. And if you'd asked me at the time, they seemed to come out of nowhere. But after the second one, when I decided to really dig deep more into understanding mental health and mood disorders, I looked much more closely at my own story. And actually, I had been quite an anxious child. And I'd come quite close to a depressive episode in my adolescence, which was interesting when I came to researching and looking at teenage mental health. And if you go on the Royal College of Psychiatrists website, they come up with six possible reasons for depression and mood disorders. And one of them is a hormonal link. And
Mm.
obviously, adolescents are having huge hormonal changes. And then I became very depressed after having bringing up small children. And there's a big link there, sort of postnatal, which, by the way, isn't just immediately after have children, but can run for quite a few months, even years after that kind of huge bomb, as it were, going off of having small children. And then menopausal women and indeed men, there's another big hormonal shift, and there's another big link with a more prevalence and vulnerability to depression. So, yes, I suppose there's what I thought at the time and what I now realise.
Do they, one of those six things, do they mention epigenetic trauma, i.e., potential for inherited trauma through generations?
Yes, I think that's become a really interesting field of study. I think stress is one, as you know, periods of very high stress. There seems to be a genetic link on some things, possibly certainly depression and maybe schizophrenia. They're thinking there's a genetic link. So yes, your point about the epigenetic, so which genes kind of get switched on and off depending on what you've experienced, childhood experiences and childhood trauma being very relevant. But there is, I would say, still a lot of uncertainty exactly why people succumb. And they have a phrase, I think they called it endogenous depression, and that means there's no obvious reason why it happens. And we're woefully behind on research more broadly into the reasons and the answers, and we just still know so little about the brain. But people are trying to figure this stuff out.
I can't remember who said it, but someone very bright said, only an idiot will tell you how the brain works.
Yeah, yeah. And when I was researching the adolescent brain, because obviously one clear idea is that we want to try and connect and understand our teenagers. So if we understand what's going on in their brains, we've got a better chance of doing so. And amazingly, research about the adolescent brain only started about 15 years ago. So we used to think that there was this huge kind of growth spurt in the brain, sort of 0 to 2, which there is, all this sort of synaptic pruning and big changes. But the same thing happens during adolescence. But we're very new to that party of understanding exactly what's happening. There's a great neuroscientist called Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's doing a lot of the sort of pioneering research about what's going on, and this idea of, as I say, the synaptic pruning, but particularly the development of the prefrontal cortex, which you probably know about, which is the reasoned and taking responsible decisions and impulse control, and what's happening to that during the teenage brain. But yeah, so it's interesting how new that research is, and again,
Well,
how little we know.
it's not a surprise to me because teenagers are so busy, they actually don't have time to offer themselves up as guinea pigs for, for
Yes,
researchers. There's so much going on.
yeah, you make a really good point as well, because one of the reasons there has been little research is that you have to get confidentiality agreements and you have to get
Exactly.
parents to agree. And, as you say, one of the main things I found when talking to teenagers over the last 5 years and parents and teachers is this feeling of overwhelm.
Exactly.
They've just got
So
such a
who's
lot
got
on.
time to be a guinea pig?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, that was a big feeling I had. I remember interviewing an adolescent psychiatrist, and I was very struck. So she said when she's working with a troubled teenager, she would make stick models to kind of work therapeutically. So you'd have mom, dad, and teenager. And because teenagers, as you say, are so overwhelmed and they've got so much going on for them, that if the stick figures of the mom and dad collapse, teenagers are completely freaked out. Which is a big message in a way of my book, The Gift to Teenagers, is that how can we stay calm through this and not be overwhelmed ourselves, so that we're in the best place to kind of connect and support our teenagers.
well, it's true. Your first chapter really focuses on how you have to look after yourself before you're in a position to look after anybody else, which is obviously
Yeah,
really commonsensical. And they say it on the airlines, you got to put your own mask on before you help anyone else. But as a parent, that often just flies out the window, because especially if your child's unhappy or miserable, you have this overwhelming urge to step in and fix it. And actually, much of the time, that is the wrong response. You have to let the kids work it out for themselves.
that is a really, really key message of the book, and it came from sort of talking to quite a lot of psychotherapists, and indeed my own experience as a mother of five. But one thing is that when we suggest that somebody has a big problem and that we're going to jump in and fix it, it makes them out to be broken, and only we can sort them out. And actually, if you think about it for a moment, what we actually want to do is help them lean in and believe in their own strengths. Because much as we would like to fix everything for them, we can support them, but really the person that's going to fix them is them. And that is such an empowering message, and it gives teenagers such a feeling of agency and power, rather than they're going to have to rely on us, or they're going to have to rely on the medical professional, somebody else to sort them out. It's not to say that there are times when we don't need to be very present and supportive, but it's a sort of different lens of how we look at the situation. One exercise that I use in workshops with parents is just to pause, and before you even interact, just like take a few breaths, and then just bring to mind all your teenager's strengths and all the good things about them. And so what we focus on expands, and it's from that position that we're likelier to have a better interaction than, oh my God, they're a problem, they're broken, we're the rescuers, we've got to fix them. So it's the difference between assistance and rescuing. So we want to
Yes.
assist, but not jump in and make them out to be broken.
Although, without question, there are times where parents absolutely have to step in, for example, and
Yes,
and you have
yes.
to obviously use your common sense and to figure out which is which. And common sense ain't that common, especially when emotions are involved. And it is very tricky.
Yeah, I mean, most of what I'm writing about is everyday ups and downs, but my last section of the book is about more serious mental health problems. And as
Hmm.
you say, navigating. So Freud had this expression, ordinary human unhappiness. So that's what we're all dealing with. You yourself said that you'd had a very unhappy period, but that's not necessarily the same as clinical depression. And it is really tricky. It is really tricky because we don't have a blood test, we don't have a MRI scan, things are self-reported, and it is hard to know, how serious is this. And also because crucially with adolescents, they're changing so fast. So what might be really serious one day, they could be sunshine and laughter the next. So
Exactly. And also two teenagers will have completely different responses to the same event,
yeah,
and it will affect them in
exactly.
different ways. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, what I would say is, having worked with lots of professionals in the field, I think that parents can also feel confident that a good clinical psychologist or a good psychiatrist should be skilled at trying to navigate that. The problem that I think a lot of parents have is that they're not getting to see those specialists. They're getting to see their GP if they're lucky. And it's not a GP's fault, but they've got 8 minutes on the clock. And it's very difficult to have that kind of sophisticated understanding. So I think that's the real problem right now.
But also, don't you think there's been such an explosion recently of diagnoses for various conditions that I mean, I did an online test, and according to the test, I have severe ADHD.
Yeah,
But I'm 54 years old now. I'm certainly not going to do anything about it. And if it's true, then I've learned how to live with it. And do you
yeah.
think we're over medicalizing what are actually normal ranges of human emotion?
By the
Um,
way, before I answer, you do not look 52. So whatever you're taking,
oh, 54 actually,
54.
54.
Well, you don't look 54 either.
Oh, thank
Um,
you very much.
yeah, no, look. So I started working in mental health in 2014. So I did a memoir, which I was lucky because it was a Sunday Times bestseller, and because of that, I was able to get involved with lots of different mental health organisations, and I became an ambassador for SANE and Rethink Mental Illness, and worked with quite a lot of people in the field. And I think what's happened is we've sort of overcorrected. So when I started in 2014, people said, "Oh, you're really brave," by which they meant bonkers, to write about having severe
Well,
depression.
actually, I think you're bonkers to have had 5 kids, but that's a whole other story. I've only got
Well,
one,
I
and
did have surprise twins. I had three, and then I had these two sort of late lambs. But yes, that's another topic. But yes, just rewinding to overdiagnosis, I think that there's been this sort of overcorrection, and obviously social media's had a role to play in terms of everybody can go online and Dr. Google. And it, by the way, the overdiagnosis thing isn't just happening with mental health conditions, it's happening across the board. But as I said, the problem with mental health problems is that people make this false comparison, which is, oh, it's we should not have any stigma around it because it's just like breaking your leg. Well, it's just not like breaking your leg.
yes, it is. It is subjective, isn't
It
it?
is subjective. So that's a problem. And when it comes to young people, that's a whole nother area because they are digital natives in a way that perhaps we weren't. And there is this huge development in the teenage brain. Well, autonomy is a big thing happening for them, but also peer pressure. So this sort of thing about so for example, if you take eating disorders, people talk about social contagion, whereby if one person has it or is diagnosed, then that becomes something within a group. So, and because of the online world, that feeling of overdiagnosis is probably even stronger among young people than it is with adults because they're all at school together, etc. So I think probably it's beginning to slightly move back again because it has got out of hand. And I think the really powerful argument why even young people and lots of people in this field are beginning to adjust is because people who've got really serious problems aren't getting the help.
Yes.
And it's almost like a
But
sort of moral thing that actually, okay, I'm anxious, I'm a bit up and down. So the number one mental health condition is anxiety, way and above anything else. And there's a huge range within, oh, I'm stressed about my exam, which is obviously the case for lots of young people and their parents
that's
right now.
perfectly normal to be stressed about your exams, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then what you would call, generalized anxiety disorder, which would be considered a mental health condition. But I think within that very broad range, there's a very interesting sort of ethical conversation that's happening now among young people about actually, you know what? other people might need serious help and assistance, as per our earlier chat, and maybe I can manage this. And there are good ways to manage it.
So there definitely are. And going back to your book, one of the things you're keen to stress is that you don't have to be a super parent. You don't have to be super mum or super dad.
Yeah.
Being good enough is really all that's required, because the expectation is that a brilliant mum will just step in and solve every single problem. And, whereas being good enough often means just listening to what your child has to say rather than always rushing in to offer a solution.
Yeah. So there's been a huge trend along with the overdiagnosis to this sort of perfectionist tendency. Again, we see perfect mum influencers on social media. And what's interesting is it's prevalent among young people, especially teenage girls, but it's also prevalent among parents. But it's such a relaxing approach for young people if parents fess up and say, oh, rupture and repair, I've made a mistake, because it allows them to make mistakes. And in fact, we could even reframe that one step further, which is there's no such thing as mistakes. There's just learning opportunities. Stumbling blocks can be stepping stones. And for example, there's little areas where this approach is so helpful. So for example, lying. So, teenagers, we all lie actually. Some bits of research said that we lie around 30 to 40 times a day.
Really?
It does seem very high,
So
but
few.
well, yeah, okay, so few. Well, that includes all those white lies and
Yes,
whatever.
absolutely. Yeah.
But back to that idea of not being perfect. So what do we really want? We want connection. And the whole book
Mm.
really is, how can we have this connection? So we want this connection. And if teenagers feel ashamed, shame is a huge thing, that they're wrong and they're judged as wrong, as opposed to learning and growing, we're likely to have a much more honest conversation with them. And they're likely to be able to be more truthful about what's really happening for them. And we can do the same and put our hands up and say, yeah, well, you know what? I was exhausted. I had a long day at work. I wasn't my best self. And it just
Well,
dials
shame
down
is
that.
it's a very corrosive emotion, isn't it? But unfortunately, it's one of the most effective ones to get people to change their behavior. And I think now there's a blurring of the boundaries between the generations. So certainly when I was a teenager, there was a lot more of a hierarchy and authority, which obviously was there to be pushed against, but we had to do it in very sneaky ways. We were actually horribly dishonest as kids, and we had a drinking culture, smoking was rife, whereas this generation of teenagers don't really go for that. Maybe they've learned some lessons, and when it does happen, if kids get involved in addictive substances, or it's usually very marked, and so things have changed. But now a lot of parents are constantly told, you shouldn't be your child's friend, you're the child's parent. And in fact, you write quite honestly about this, that because as women we're brought up to be people pleasers, it's difficult to be authoritative with your child, whereas I don't think previous generations had that issue at all.
No, well, just so many interesting points there. But yes, so this idea that every generation is different, I mean, it would be fair to say that the differences are really huge now because of the way, as you say, changes in how we view people, that a less of a hierarchy, a less of a sense of authority, teenagers finding other sources of authority online and having relationships away from the family online. So there's that option which didn't exist before. So how do we stay kind of
Well, I don't know if
important?
that's true. I certainly had lots of relationships I don't think my parents would have been very happy with, and I certainly didn't grow up with social media, thank goodness. But
Yes.
this is
Well,
an
yes.
additional pressure. We were able to make pretty huge mistakes, which stay in our teenage years, whereas now this can, it can potentially follow you forever.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean that's one of the great kind of illusions about the online world, is that somehow it's temporary and it will go, but it can stay with you forever. And teenagers live with a lot of fear that they will be cancelled or that they'll
Hmm.
make a mistake online. And as you say, when we were growing up, we were making lots of mistakes, but there was no record of the fact that puked behind the bicycle shed or got off with six people one night. And I was doing sort of plenty of that myself. By the way, you also made an interesting
Delighted to
point.
hear it, Rachel.
Yeah, no, no, certainly, they were fun days as well, weren't they, in a way? I mean, I
But
sometimes
I
feel
wouldn't
that
repeat
teenagers,
them, not if you paid me. That's the thing. They were lots of fun, as you say, but there was so much anxiety. And I don't mean the medicalized kind, I mean the normal kind. There was a
yeah,
very, there were lots of anxious moments as teenagers. And, I just think when you don't know yourself and you're experimenting and you get it horribly wrong sometimes.
yeah. I mean, I do think that these kinds of open conversations and the fact that we can be more open with our own teenagers, that mental health is a topic, that psychological health is a topic, how to manage their thoughts, how to manage their feelings. These are all things that are more widely talked about now. And that would have been terrific growing up. I don't think I ever had this sort of conversation with my own parents. I mean, and I had absolutely no way of managing very strong feelings, which, as we were saying earlier, are such a feature of teenage life. And also for parents, I mean, I sometimes think that when people get very upset about phones, and I so understand that because there's some terrible things that you can see online, but I think a lot of it is a very strong feeling of rejection among parents themselves, that their teenagers would rather be on their phones. And you feel very deeply that, oh, you don't want to talk to me, but you're sort of addicted to your phone before we even get to parents being addicted to your phone. I'm
Mm.
slightly rambling here, but you also made that point of the sort of rebellion being different. So,
Mm.
and that's absolutely true. So things like drinking, drug taking, lots of, I don't know if you would call them markers of adult life, but having relationships, first jobs. This is sort of obviously kind of younger people. There's an academic in America called Jean Twenge, Twenge, and
You
she's
mention
done,
her in the book, don't you?
yeah, and she's done lots of really interesting work about this idea that a lot of these developmental stages are happening later. And one reason is this idea of we're sort of tiger parents on top of our children and overly trying to kind of control them, and that actually we might be better stepping back alongside with this kind of adopting, there's no such thing as perfect, but just stepping back and trying to be less controlling.
It's really difficult to do that. In fact, I remember reading in the paper once about these parents who were trying to instill resilience in their children. They wanted their kids to walk to school. And I think one child was about 7 and the other 5. And they taught the kids how to walk to school. And actually, other parents complained so much. And there was a social media pile-on. And these parents found they couldn't do it. And this is so neurotic of other people to decide how you should parent your. I personally think those parents should have been free to make that decision and shouldn't have been. I mean, you're free to have an opinion about it, but it's not up to you to change it. It's.
Yeah. Well, look, I think a couple of points there. I think that because we have got such a problem with so many miserable teenagers and really quite a lot of miserable parents, it's almost like sometimes things have got to get really bad before we change the zeitgeist. So the zeitgeist has been what you might call safetyism, overprotective parents,
Mm.
not letting your child kind of navigate their way home from a party, being there sitting in your car for half an hour as a sort of taxi driver. Whatever we're doing, we've got some really difficult outcomes right now. And I think when I talk to parents, it's interesting that it's almost like, okay, well, maybe we should try something a little bit different now, because whatever we're doing, we have a real problem. People use that word epidemic, and I don't really like it, but there are very high anxiety rates among teenagers. And I think that you probably come across the Jonathan Haidt book, The Anxious Generation, which is talking about young people.
I
But for
haven't read
me,
it. Heard of it.
but for me, it's parents themselves that have gone absolutely overboard on this worry thing. And it's almost like if they're worrying, they're doing something. And I get that. But actually, that isn't a very great place to come from in terms of interacting and connecting to your teenagers, being super worried yourself. So, as you said, that's why I've sort of structured the book about how can you manage your own emotional regulation, your own thinking styles to dial down that worry and slightly step away from the competitive worrying at the school gates. I did a workshop recently in a school and I was talking about this kind of worry culture. And a parent said at the end, but aren't we supposed to worry? Isn't that what parents are supposed to do? And we sort of got into this sort of Socratic dialogue. And I said, well, how does that feel, worrying? And she said, well, it feels crap. And I said, well, is that when you're then interacting with your teenager because you're feeling rubbish? how does that interaction go? Well, she goes, well, not very well. We just sort of shout at each other. And so what we actually want is a good relationship and a connected relationship and good communication. So we want to start, if we possibly can, from dialing down that worry.
But don't you think part of the issue as well with teenagers is this remorseless expectation that they'll achieve all the time? So,
Yeah.
and part of this is, I suppose it started in the 80s, where everyone must have prizes, and the idea that competition was a bad thing, and that, it was a sort of a lowest common denominator effect, which actually I think has really not served kids well at all, because the world is competitive. But within that furious rat race, there's time and space to find your own way. And we don't communicate that well enough to teenagers. That if they're
Yeah.
not brilliant at school, they'll have an opportunity to shine afterwards. In fact, certainly in my school days, the top achievers aren't necessarily the ones who've done best in life. Although that is such a difficult thing to measure, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the academic school system and getting a string of A stars, and lots of people are going through that right now with the sort of exam season. It obviously it tests a specific set of skills, which have, you might say, almost randomly being set as important. I
And
think the
actually, where
message,
girls, funny enough, do better than boys. They do better in
yes,
exams
because of
generally than.
exactly because well, we don't quite know how their brain works, but the difference between, sprinters and marathon runners and people who are better at coursework and all those sorts of things. I think the message to share with teenagers and your children is that actually we have lots of gifts. All of us have lots of gifts, and the game in life is just to find your gift and line up with it as best you can. And school will judge certain gifts, but it certainly, to your point, will not judge all the gifts that you have. And so if the more we can kind of encourage a kind of spaciousness and what other things might, be fulfilling. And a really simple rule of thumb is, do you feel good when you're doing this? So I think in that sense, it was useful to have a large family, because some of my children were more suited to enjoying academic work and some of them really weren't. And you didn't have to make it up. You could just see the ones that were thriving in that system and the ones that were absolutely floundering. And it wasn't a right wrong thing. It wasn't a judgment thing. It was just, that's who they were. So I think a kind of feeling of, as you say, a kind of, the world is a bigger place. And any way you can introduce that concept, and in quite practical ways as well, sort of introduce them to other things that may or may not be on the curriculum. Because as you know, with the sort of back to the Tory education reforms, schools on the whole lost a lot of extracurricular things and became more narrowly academic, which obviously, as you say, it is a competitive world, but there are other ways of being and achieving, which have gone by the wayside quite broadly.
Well, I was a pretty terrible student because I was too busy reading Jackie Collins and I just wanted to, and Virginia Andrews and all those really gripping books that came out, and I certainly was hopeless at studying, and I was really bad at revising. But when I started working, I got it. I suddenly saw how important it was to be reliable, to turn up for work on time, to be committed, to work as part of a team. And I bet you someone could have shouted at me until the cows came home about all those things when I was a teenager, and they wouldn't have made a single bit of headway. And it's
Yeah.
only by, so I really do think that, kids should not despair if they don't do well at school. There are online courses, there are all sorts of ways you can navigate your way to
Yeah.
leading a good life. So,
And you make a really good point there, which is, even though I've written a whole book full of thoughts and strategies and advice, but if somebody doesn't ask your advice, especially your teenager, they're not going to listen. So how you navigate when to come up with ideas or philosophies, sometimes you can be really have very sort of simple things like, would you like me just to listen to you right now, or would you like some advice or some ideas about what you might do? So it's almost sort of stealth advice, not, or well, that's obviously direct, but also sort of modeling it in yourself, of different ways you can find fulfillment or step into your gifts, which is sort of less narrow, really, than, as you say, than a kind of school thing. One thing I'd say, which is I love the research, was about more broadly helping teenagers and young people have a more compassionate voice to themselves,
Hmm.
so that if they are in the system where they're not particularly flourishing, they don't beat themselves up about it. And one really good way to do that is some of the volunteering work, or working with charities, or working with local kind of community groups, which allows you to see other kinds of people who maybe have other kinds of struggles. And I love the idea that that helped you in turn be gentler on yourself and not beat yourself up about, I didn't get the string of A stars.
Oh, I probably beat myself. I mean, I didn't get a string of A stars, but I did all right. And actually,
Yeah,
that's the thing, isn't it? Being good enough is really half the battle, isn't it? I
yeah.
remember my dad saying to my brother once got 53% in a maths exam, and my dad said, "You've done 3% too much studying, my boy."
I love it. He sounds fabulous, your dad. I like all that stuff about the tennis players, the fact that even Wimbledon champions, they only get 51% shots in,
Yes.
49% of the shots go out, which is, I
Yeah,
think,
but
again,
because you have to be a risk taker in order to win, you've got to learn to take
yes,
some risks, and that is another thing we do not allow our kids to do, and we really should. We should allow them to risk, and we should obviously not, bungee jump without a rope or things like that, but we should allow them to try things and to fail as well. We should
yeah,
allow them to fail so that overall they become more resilient. And I
yeah.
think we're really bad at doing that.
Now, I like that line from the American Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran. He's got this lovely line about being the bow that is stable from which the arrow shoots forth. But it's
Yes.
actually not our job to oversee that arrow and whatever it's getting up to. And as you say, that's how we learn is, not, this quote of getting sort of everything right. But I think that control is everywhere. And it's interesting. I think quite a lot of parents, again, with good intentions, they have a very strong feeling that they need to control, which actually, if you think about it for a moment, is quite silly in a way, because it's very hard to control somebody else, especially a teenager, especially when they're up against this huge surge for autonomy. And I suppose the best you can say is that parents are trying to be controlling for good reasons, because they feel that that's how they're going to keep teenagers safe. But sometimes when they're controlling, they do it by doing the right wrong thing. So you're wrong if you do that. And
Mm.
I think a really useful thing is to step away from those kind of judgments and notice when you're making them, and just come back to the sort of idea, well, people can see things differently. And our teenagers are going to see things very differently to us, and just having more respect for that.
Mm. But I think if they're allowed to take small risks and often get it wrong, it teaches them more about risk taking in general. Whereas if you completely cosset a child, they might get it spectacularly wrong, in a
Yes,
life changing way, which is obviously.
absolutely. And that is exactly what's happening if you look at the studies. So basically, people talk about middle adolescence, sort of 14 to 18, much more control. And then children, teenage or young people arriving at university and absolutely not being able
I'm
to
just
cope with
going
being,
bonkers, right?
yeah. And I mean, putting their clothes in the microwave because they'd never washed their own laundry. And I mean, yeah, so actually helping out at home is another way of stepping away from this sort of infantilizing, we do everything for them, we take away all the risks. But smoothing the road actually may be counterintuitive. Well, it is a problem.
Yeah, I think I was doing quite well on all the things we've talked about, except for the helping out at home. If I try and get my kid to help me make supper, she'll chop a mushroom and then she'll quietly sneak away.
Yes, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
I quite
she's
I
she's
quite
pretty
like
lazy, that little moo. So
yeah. There's quite a nice sort of supper trick which you can do, which is just like one night a week. It's like you're not going to cook supper at all, and
hmm
then just see what happens.
yeah, she
And
made the
and
most
then
delicious sausage rolls the other day. So it's not all
yeah,
bad.
or a sandwich night. You just put
Yeah,
out some bread and people can help themselves. But people say, oh well, then my teenager won't eat. Well, have you ever heard of a teenager who isn't hungry? At some point
yeah,
they're going to eat.
exactly,
But it's
exactly.
just having that confidence that we're not the absolute be all and end all. They are able to cope much more than we think.
And fish and chips every now and then is really not going to kill you.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, no, it sounds like we're on quite similar sort
Yes,
of
it does. Although, I have to say one of the things, and I'm sure you've had this question before,
yeah,
the people who would read this book are probably the kind of parents who are better than they think and are doing okay. Whereas, how do you reach the people who really need help, who are actually very unlikely to pick up a book like this? Um, it's
yeah. Well,
it's
I
a
know what you mean.
self-selecting readership, isn't it? And I say that with the I really enjoyed reading it. So, but you know it's a very reassuring read. It's very and it you bring up some really interesting points. How do you reach the people who are in much more precarious situations, who
Yeah,
are really struggling, and how do we better support? For
yeah. I mean,
example,
I think. Well, in my own life, so after I first wrote my memoir in 2014, um, working with the charities helped stay kind of much more grassroots, and traveling around the country and running workshops for Mind or Rethink and going to godforsaken places, because there's a complete overlap between mental health problems and social deprivation, because so much of it is life circumstances, poor housing, unemployment, family breakdown. So you're absolutely right. It is hard to reach these people, parents who might not naturally read a book. I mean, my own answer is to stay grassroots and to run workshops, alongside charities and things like that, which is a way to just talk to people. And I think some of the messages in the book resonate, especially the sort of stepping away from judgment, the sort of the good enough, um, you know, even things like 80% of the time trying to have something decent to eat, as opposed to kind of beating yourself up about all the times that, as you say, you get the fish and chips. What I like to think is there's a kind of warmth and a sort of authorial kind of arm around your shoulder, which does connect with parents of all sorts. But no, you're right. Probably those sorts of parents are hard to reach, and they're hard to reach actually for mental health services. And in fact, there's more of an effort to try and go out directly in the community rather than wait for people to come when there are problems. But it's a very valid point. It is difficult.
PTSD, for example, is a real issue with people who return from the military, from war zones, etc. But I remember reading a really interesting study which showed that actually a lot of these people go into the military with PTSD because of very, very tough home backgrounds. Because a lot of the time, the soldiers, the cannon fodder, if you like, have come from poverty stricken backgrounds with family breakdowns. And so it makes you think of it in a completely different way, doesn't it? And there should be more support, as I think there's systemic failure in the set. For example, the grooming gangs in Oxford and Rotherham and other places in the UK, where some of the parents were crying out for help and yet
Implicit.
they were ignored.
Yeah.
And so these are how do we change this about our society? And I realize that's such a tricky question. It's not
Yeah.
all on you to solve. I have to say that quickly, but you must have given it a lot of thought.
Well, we do need to work with the institutions where people find themselves. So whether that's
That's the
schools,
problem. The institutions broke down. And
yeah.
this is where resilience by itself doesn't help you. It's a perfect storm, if you like. Do you think we've actually learned any lessons from this? Do you think it would be different if it happened again?
Well, I'm a very sort of optimistic person, and I do think that since I've been involved in this field, so since 2014, there have been massive, massive changes in terms of awareness and support. So if you think of most adults, um, actually, where are they spending most time? They're at work. And
Mm.
I would say that something to be optimistic about is that employers are really trying to move the dial about being more supportive and encouraging and advocates for mental health, and looking after their employees more effectively and making workplaces less stressful. And it's not really rocket science, working with HR and allowing flexible working. For example, young mothers who are wanting to work but also have got small children, how can they make workplaces more supportive? And there's just no question that when I was working in the newsroom at the Times, it just was no comparison to the awareness and the support that workplaces can provide. So I think that's something to hold on to be optimistic. Yes, of course, there will always be appalling pockets of systemic failure. And mental health is still the poor relation on every metric if you take the NHS. So far less spent on research. If you take adolescent mental health, we've only got around 800 adolescent psychiatrists and in the country, and we've got
It's
around
astonishing, isn't it?
800,000 people waiting for treatment on CAMS, on child and adolescent mental health services. So we've got we have got a way to go, but I do remain positive because so much has happened in the last 10 years.
It's true that workplaces are so much more supportive now, not only of
Yeah,
mental health issues, but of family life in general. Whereas, 20, 30 years ago, it was very rigid. You turned up at 9 and you left at 5, and now things have completely changed.
yeah. And I
So,
think there's another optimistic thing that's happening is that I think that there's still this idea that women take the greater sort of parenting load, and that's probably still the case. But there's no question, again, that has transformed in terms of more fathers' involvement. And I think, if anything, that's only going to increase. And one of the strong themes in the book is kind of the absolute centrality of fathers to this process, and this idea of maternal gatekeeping when we keep fathers out of things. And I think if I talk to younger parents, it's really interesting to observe how different they are in terms of both fathers and mothers being involved in a new way.
well, there's an expectation they'll be involved now,
Yeah,
whereas previously it was just an optional extra, wasn't it? I only have one daughter, but my husband has four daughters. So,
right.
I've got three older step kids. They're all in their late 20s, 30s now. And so my daughter, age 13, is there's no problem she has that he hasn't seen before.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, and that is a big societal shift, which again is optimistic because all the research shows that two parents are better than one for all sorts of reasons. So that involvement of fathers is something very positive to hold on to.
well,
And
it
I
is, and
probably
also the ability of teenage girls in particular to have quite personal conversations with their fathers, which would have
yes,
been impossible
unthinkable.
for us.
Yeah. And I
So,
think possibly the third reason for optimism is that I think that a little bit like that correction on diagnosis, I think that we are now possibly getting to real understanding of the dangers of smartphones and the digital world. And we're not yet there, but I think there is a very strong feeling now, and there are networks all over the country of parents getting together, banning smartphones. And I think that is new as well. And it's interesting because if you look at the research in America versus the UK, so in America, elite families never did let their children have smartphones. The tech
no, the Silicon
titans,
Valley tech giants don't
exactly.
let their own kids have smartphones, which is all you need to know, really, isn't it?
All you need
And
to know. But we in the UK were very unusual. We let everybody pretty much do what they wanted. We were very liberal about smartphones, but also we are a more regulated kind of environment. So there is a possibility that will change. And I mean, I think you've got to be careful because my own view is, if you ban something, people are more drawn to it, especially teenagers who want to be autonomous. But an understanding of the dangers and the fact that young people and teenagers themselves are beginning to realise how
well,
dangerous.
that's really the thing that's changed is their own understanding that actually
Yes,
it is.
yes, yes, and quite often now you'll find it's more that mums are addicted to Instagram, and lots of young people have come off it, including my own daughters, and I notice that they're actually ahead of me.
Mhm.
And I think that's quite interesting. And that's even before you think about what schools are up to. And so I think there are some causes of optimism, but as you say, there's still some dreadful pockets.
Yeah, and actually, my daughter's school does not teach with, iPads or smart. It's all pen and paper still, and I'm all for that. I really do not support electronics in the classroom, other than for computer studies, because I think it's really important that hand-eye coordination, writing. I think it's very important for thought as well.
So it's interesting. I'm sure you watched Adolescence, but I thought
I
it was.
didn't watch it. I think I'm the only person on the planet who hasn't. So
Well, I just thought that Keir Starmer's response was misguided because what he said, oh, I better watch the time. But basically, he had this idea that, put it out in loads of schools. But young people know all this stuff. I mean, the people who didn't know it was us, adults. But yeah, but which is also the reason why I do think there's this sort of cause for optimism, is they're not stupid and they can figure out, even if you're with a room of teenagers and you ask them how they're feeling and how do they feel when they've been on on social media for 5 hours, they'll tell you they feel awful.
yeah.
So
And
I,
actually,
I am optimistic on that.
just going back to adolescence, and I haven't seen it, so it's unfair of me to pronounce on this, but
Yeah.
I read a very interesting article about it, which said there was a fundamental dishonesty about adolescence because middle class boys who come from two-parent families are not the ones committing knife crime in this
Oh,
country.
100%. We know from the
And
figures. It's
yet
black children.
no one will tell the truth about it because we're so fundamentally dishonest about cause and effect, and until that changes,
Yeah.
these problems
Well,
can't be tackled.
knife crime is overwhelmingly people, in difficult circumstances, social deprivation in gangs, and they are overwhelmingly black, and that's the facts. It's a bit
Exactly.
like
Or black or mixed race.
people skirt round as well, how important it is to stay a stable married family remains every bit of data, but it's difficult for
And the
people to say that.
importance of role models, male role models to
Yeah,
young, especially, well, not just young teenage boys. It's so important for girls to have male role models too.
yeah. And we don't we
Good.
don't have nearly enough male teachers,
Mm,
and that's a real problem. And we do need good male role models to counteract the Andrew Tate.
yes,
I think I
exactly.
ought to probably go just because I've got to go, but I'm very happy to talk more. It's been so interesting.
Yeah, it has been super interesting, and we could bang on forever,
We
actually.
could
So,
actually.
and I know you're running off to a funeral, is that right?
I'm afraid I'm in my sort of
But
dark garb.
I hope the fact that you're wearing polka dots means it was a good innings.
Yes, that's a whole nother discussion. I suppose having looked a lot around stigma and mental health, there's also a stigma around death, and it's always a loss. But actually, it can be a celebration as well. And I'm trying to approach it. This somebody was a life very well lived, and it wasn't a
That's
tragedy.
hence the polka dots. That was really my question. A life well lived. That's always, and those are always the most fun funerals to go to.
Yes, yes, absolutely. All
I love a
right. Well,
good
listen.
funeral.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, let me know if you want to do any more or whether you think you've got enough, but we can adjust around that.
That would be great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And actually, I think we've touched on pretty much,
I think
you know,
we did range quite far and wide.
we did. We did
Yeah,
indeed. But
yeah.
I'd be happy to chat to you again, maybe about your other books another time.
Oh, well, that
Um,
would be lovely. Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I've written about nutrition and mental health, and I've written about poetry and mental health. So all my books are trying to find good practical answers to things.
Okay, brilliant.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Indie Book Club. I'm your host, Cathy Evans from Inkspot Publishing, who sponsor all these podcasts. To all cooks, dog walkers, and drivers out there, we'd love to see you next time. Bye.